Hi everyone. In what I think we can all call an eerie coincidence, we embark this week on our discussion of commercial impracticability. So let's get started. If I can advance these slides. All right. So now that we've spent a few weeks marinating in warranties, as well as the ways in which warranties can be disclaimed and the ways in which remedies can be limited under contracts for sales of goods. And we've concluded that discussion with the takeaway that at least for consumers, Magnuson-Moss limits how much sellers can really avoid implied warranties. We're going to take a few classes to talk about excuse doctrines. So times when parties can get out of their sales contracts. First, today, focusing on situations where circumstances are beyond the control of the parties, and then for circumstances in which a court avoids a contract due to unconscionability of either the procedure in which the contract was entered into and or the actual substantive terms of the agreement. Later, we're going to talk about how buyers can get out of contracts in situations where sellers don't send conforming goods. And there, we will also talk about anticipatory repudiation, which is a topic that you likely covered in your contracts class, and special considerations for getting out of long-term installment contracts as well. And we'll talk about these along with the doctrines of rejection and revocation by buyers that we're going to get to next week. So just to situate us now in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about the provisions in Part 6 of Article 2 that talk about really sellers' non-performance or excuses for sellers largely. And sometimes it's not, again, most of the time with these doctrines, it's not directly attributable to fault of the seller. It's something happens so that either the goods themselves are damaged or rendered non-existent. That's our 2613 casualty to identified goods, or the seller simply cannot perform because of circumstances that were not anticipated by the parties at the time of entering into the contract and that are not due to the fault of the seller. So we're going to talk about these provisions this week. Next week, we're going to move on to talking about some of the buyers' available options in situations where they receive non-conforming goods from the seller. Let's quickly review the common law around excuses for performance. There's a few sub-doctrines within it that I think are worth just reviewing. So first of all, while contracts as a whole cover both goods and services, I think since we're talking about the common law, think of a service. For example, you agree to babysit your friend's 3 kids every Thursday for the next 6 months at your friend's house in exchange for $100 a week. Let's start with the idea of impossibility. These are broadly things like death of the promisor, destruction of something critical to the contract, government law or regulations telling you you can't do the thing. Your performance could be excused, for example, if you were killed in an accident. If your friend's house burns down and they move to a different town, or if the local council passes some sort of city ordinance that would require you to purchase a governmental license to watch more than 2 kids at a time that are not your own children. Those are all events that might make your performance impossible. Then there are doctrines like frustration of purpose, where an unforeseen event occurs and that interferes with the party's principal purpose for entering the contract in the first place. Say, for example, your friend had a job that required her to travel on weekends and her spouse could only take Fridays off. That's why your friend hired you to help watch the kids on Thursdays. Your friend's spouse ends up getting laid off, so he can now stay home with the kids. Now, let's assume, for instance, that you're not going to be nice and just roll with this. Let's assume that you are feeling litigious and so you argue, oh, I'm not going to let you out of our contract. I realize that your spouse can now watch the kids, but we have an agreement. You're going to give me $100 a week for 6 months to watch your kids. Your friend might, as a defense, argue frustration of purpose to get out of the remainder of the contract. So these doctrines are broadly impossibility, or sometimes called impracticability. It's just simply not possible to do the things that you'd agreed upon. And then there is this doctrine of frustration of purpose, where the principal purpose for entering the contract anticipates or assumes that certain things are going to be the case. And if circumstances change dramatically enough that it seems to frustrate the principal purpose of the contract, then one of the parties could seek to avoid the contract. As we'll see in the UCC context, the excuse doctrines we're talking about today really deal with sellers. And so for circumstances where buyers are trying to get out of a contract and sellers have fully performed, then the only way that they can get out is likely going to be something like frustration of purpose, or perhaps some other doctrine like unconscionability, which we'll talk about later this week, or mistake. Let's talk about impracticability and the related concept of risk of loss. We often talk about these two together, but the first really focuses in the UCC context on sellers' inability to get conforming goods to the buyer. The second focuses on, based on the transaction, if something happens to the goods, who's responsible for absorbing the cost of the damage to the goods. So first, there are 2 scenarios in which commercial impracticability is likely to come up for sellers. The first, something happens to the goods themselves, and so the seller doesn't have the goods to give to the buyer. Or something unexpected affects the seller's ability to deliver the goods on time to the buyer. With respect to risk of loss, this is something that we sometimes talk about in contracts a little bit in the guise of assumption of risk, but rarely in contracts do we talk about this in as much detail as the UCC does. Risk of loss is who has to eat the costs if something happens to the goods, if something bad happens. For instance, goods are sitting in seller's warehouse. are still legally in seller's possession. There's a massive flood that wipes out the whole warehouse. In that situation, the seller bears the risk of loss for those goods. The seller can't say, well, buyer, I had earmarked these goods for you, so you're going to have to bear that cost. The seller, however, is also, in addition to having that risk of loss, still theoretically liable under their contract to the buyer to get those now destroyed goods to the buyer. That's the situation where a seller is going to try to claim commercial impracticability and an excuse for seller's inability to perform by delivering the goods. Here's another illustration. For risk of loss, there's a period of time after which the sale has been made, the transaction's been completed in terms of perhaps the buyer giving the money, or at least the sales contract itself has been executed, where the seller and buyer have completed most of their obligations, but the goods themselves have not made it to the buyer. Let's say, for example, you're buying a fragile lamp. Seller packages a lamp up carefully, mails it to you via the U.S. Postal Service, but the lamp arrives broken. Who bears the risk? The risk shifts when the seller completes its delivery obligations. But the question becomes, has the seller completed its delivery obligations when the mail carrier picks up the lamp, or when the mail carrier delivers the lamp to your door? Now, the UCC default is if the contract requires the seller to ship the good by a common carrier, then, and that goes to the buyer's destination, right? So shipped via common carrier to the buyer's destination, the risk passes to the buyer only when the buyer takes delivery of the goods. That's UCC 25091B. The idea here being, if you get the lamp broken and it's UCC defaults, the seller's obligation has not yet ended because their obligation flows through the delivery, and so they bear the risk of loss for the goods. The UCC provisions on impracticability are almost exclusively focusing on the seller's inability to get conforming goods to the buyer. Section 2613 talks about casualty or damage to specific goods. And so these need to be goods that, in the UCC's terms, are identified when the contract is made. Again, I think the helpful term is specific goods, so that particular painting or that particular object, as opposed to fungible goods. So if you can replace, the shipment of widgets with another shipment of widgets, then casualty doesn't necessarily excuse the performance. The idea here is that for a specific good, let's say it's the vase. If it's a total loss, the contract is avoided, right? It's voidable. If it's a partial loss, the buyer has the option of inspecting the good and electing to either avoid the contract or pay a reduced price, what the UCC calls due allowance. So if this vase is damaged in transport and through no fault of the seller was very careful, there was no negligence in how they packed the vase, it was on a train and there was a train accident and the vase was cracked. Right at that point, it's not a total loss. the vase was recovered but it's cracked, then the buyer gets to decide, do I want the cracked vase with some sort of offset for the price because it's less valuable now that it's damaged, or does the buyer get to avoid the contract entirely, in which case now it's seller's problem again. Seller still retains title ownership to the vase, but now it's a damaged vase. As you heard in my discussion, the important thing that I don't list in my slide for 2613 is that it has to be no fault of the seller. And this idea of casually to identified goods only applies when the risk of loss is still with the seller. So if, for example, and we'll talk about this more in future weeks, but if, for example, the contract was written in a way that the risk of loss shifted to the buyer, let's come up with a clearer scenario for that. So let's say the seller sells vases. The buyer says, I'm going to send one of my employees to come pick up the vase. Right? At that point, based on that situation, the law would probably say, well, the risk of loss shifts to the buyer once buyer's employee picks up the vase. So if something happens to it in transport back to the buyer's place of business, the employee has it in the car and there's a car accident, then the risk of loss would have already shifted to the buyer. These provisions wouldn't apply. I don't talk much about section 2614. Just note that that provision allows substitute performance in the event there really is a situation of commercial impracticability in the delivery of the goods. So say that seller had a contract to deliver goods by rail. Both parties thought that a rail line ran to the town of delivery. Turns out there is no rail line. In that case, right, the seller could try to stop delivery, avoid the contract, but buyer can still make the deal go forward. And it might be, for instance, that there's a discussion about, well, can we change the means of delivery? Right? So seller can try to deliver the goods in another way. For instance, if you couldn't go by rail, maybe you could go by truck. Sections 2615 and 2616 on excuse of performance by sellers and notice to the buyer that seller is not going to be able to perform, I think are pretty straightforward, but they're also fairly subjective. And most of the scenarios you'll deal with here involve whether whatever event that happened that made the performance impracticable really was reasonably something the seller would not have anticipated. Right? Because if it is something that the seller should have anticipated, then the seller should have been able to plan around it. Or when the seller knew something was going wrong, right? Did the seller provide notice to the buyer? The comments to the UCC are not very specific about when seller's hardship arises to the level of impracticability. Comment 4, for instance, says increased costs are not enough. Market collapse is not enough, but, quote, a severe shortage of raw materials or supply due to a contingency such as war may be enough. Right? So this is going to be a very subjective, situationally specific doctrine. So here are some key points. The non-delivery or the delay of the goods is not a breach by seller if it's made impracticable by the occurrence of a contingency the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption. You know how I love negative phrasing. Here, I think the easiest way to think of this is, did the parties anticipate, or could they have anticipated this event happening? And again, subject to this sort of reasonableness, right? We're very imaginative beings. We can imagine all sorts of things happening, but in the normal commercial context, would they have considered this? If the seller has some goods available, they are supposed to allocate those goods amongst buyers. As your book points out, in practice, that does not always happen. Seller must notify a buyer if there is a delay or non-delivery. They also are supposed to notify a buyer if they are allocating goods, right? We don't have enough supply, we're allocating them amongst our buyers. And the buyer has the option of discharging the seller from an unexecuted portion of their contract, or agreeing to waive the original contract and take allocation from the seller. So if the seller was supposed to deliver you 10 chairs and they send you a notice saying, due to a war in our supplier country, we are unable to import additional chairs. Based on our availability, we can give you 5 chairs. In that situation, the buyer has the option of either saying, yes, I will take the 5 chairs and essentially discharge you from your remaining obligation to give me the additional 5. Or the seller could say, I don't want any of the chairs, let's just discharge the whole contract and I'll find the chairs from somebody else. One quick hypothetical, then we'll talk about our cases for today. Let's assume that the seller has agreed to sell buyer a valuable $200,000 violin, which is currently on loan to the local symphony orchestra. The principal violinist who's using the violin drops it, causing $5,000 worth of damage. The seller bears the risk of loss on the item because the seller still holds title to the item. It's not yet been tendered to the buyer. The violin falls under which category? Is it 2613 situation that we're looking at, or a 2615 situation? So are we looking at casualty as to a specific good, or are we looking as to seller's impossibility or impracticability to tender a fully conforming good? Because of course, if the violin is damaged and you had contracted to buy an intact violin, then the seller giving you, the buyer, the damaged violin, that is a breach that the seller would need to be excused from. All right, so which situation is it? This is 2613, casualty as to identified goods. You have a specific object, this violin, that has been identified. It has been damaged. What are the seller's and buyer's option at this point? Well, the seller needs to give notice to the buyer, and at that point, since it doesn't seem to be a total loss, this is thousands of dollars, but a small amount of damage relative to the overall violin's value, the buyer has a choice here. They can avoid the contract, or they can take the violin with an offset in the price for those repair costs. Let's talk about our first case for today, Turbines Limited versus Trans Support. Now in this case, Turbines, our buyer, is seeking rescission of a purchase agreement on the grounds that turbines could no longer sell the helicopter nozzle that it had purchased to Turbine's intended buyer. And so we're looking at a chain of sale here where Turbine is really in the middle. They're purchasing a part from Transport, and then Turbines is intending to turn around and sell that part to one of its customers. The trial court ruled for Turbines. It seems as though the defendant Transport didn't bother to show up for the trial. The Court of Appeals reversed rules for seller, and ultimately the Nebraska Supreme Court here affirms the Court of Appeals. So they also rule in favor of our seller. The question here is, does Turbines get to rescind its purchase agreement with Transport? And in practice, what this rescission would look like is Turbines would return the part and get its money back from Transport. One of the things that the court really focuses on here, and so let's just review the vocabulary, is this notion of an executory contract. The idea that both parties still have obligations yet to perform under the contract. And if we look at the timeline of events here, it seems as though this contract is essentially complete. Transport has delivered the part, this turbine or this nozzle, helicopter nozzle, to Turbines, and Turbine has accepted the nozzle and paid Transport. Right? So that timeline is really important here. The performance has essentially already been completed by both buyer and seller, becomes really important to the Court of Appeals and then the Nebraska Supreme Court's analysis, because as the Court of Appeals says, no rescission because the seller had already delivered the nozzle. It's impossible to say, based on the contract itself, whether delivery to Turbine's ultimate purchaser was in fact a basic assumption of the contract. It appears that that was not clearly written into the language of the contract as, say, for example, a contingency on the party's performance, a condition of performance. They look at some other doctrines that could perhaps apply. So we see these on page 261 of your text. For instance, well, could an argument of unilateral mistake allow rescission? And there, the court says, well, unilateral mistake doesn't permit rescission because the performance was not unconscionable. That's sort of blending two doctrines. But if you think back to your contracts class days and our discussion of common law mistake, oftentimes the courts do some pretty serious equitable balancing when they're talking about excusing a party from a contract because of the mistake. Now, let's get to sort of the core basic assumption here that we really haven't discussed. So what was that core basic assumption? Think about this for a minute, knowing what you know, having read the case about the factual situation. What prompted this controversy, this dispute? Well, the fact that Turbines had paid Transport money for a helicopter part that Turbines was then forbidden by law from actually shipping to its customer. Right? So turbines can't sell the part. So the mistake or the basic assumption that would underlie a theory of excuse is that the export of the part abroad was legal. Right? That turbine, we're talking about, who made a mistake or whose assumption it seemed to be. It's that turbines had an assumption that it could legally ship this part once it had purchased the part. The court then has to think about, well, who is asking for excuse under 2615? And in this situation, is turbine our buyer or our seller? Well, with respect to these two parties, Transport is the seller. Turbines Limited was the buyer. The UCC, said the Court of Appeals, and this is on page 261, says, UCC does not support rescission because that section excuses the seller from timely delivering goods, and Transport had delivered the nozzle. Now, comment 9 to UCC 2615 does say buyer may be able to be excused from a requirements or outputs contract. So a contract that says I, the buyer, will purchase all of the goods that I require from you, or I, the buyer, will purchase all of your output of a good. But that wasn't the case here. Here we just have this one-off sale of a part. That doesn't mean you can't make common law claims. And really what this boils down to on the part of turbines, and I think this is probably the most, in some ways, intellectually honest claim they're making, is frustration of purpose. Right? But because it had not been clear that turbine's ability to export the part was necessary, was the basic assumption on which the contract was predicated, the court says, no, we are not going to allow a common law frustration of purpose here. And at the end of the day, I think that the court doesn't want to spend too much time going into this basic assumption analysis once we're in the Nebraska Supreme Court. Right? The Court of Appeals, it seems, did take a lot of time looking at basic assumption analysis. But here, the Nebraska Supreme Court says at this point in time, right, so sort of a higher level stance, they take the stance that discharge, rescission of the contract is not available because the parties have already performed. Right? And so they, in this instance, the court says the doctrine of commercial frustration applies to executory contracts alone. And because the party's performance here is fully completed, right, fully performed, then they're not going to allow a common law frustration claim in this case. Let's look also at what kind of notice is required by sellers to buyers, both in terms of suppliers. So in the event that a seller wants to claim that they're having a supply issue, what sorts of things should they be telling their buyers. And then when the seller knows that they are going to have an issue getting the goods to the customers, what sort of notice should they be giving to the buyers, to sellers' customers? This is our case of Board of Education versus Bobby Murray Chevrolet. The North Carolina school boards, the plaintiffs ordered a ton of buses. Bobby Murray Chevrolet was the low bidder on this bus contract. So they bid on 1,200 chassis, bus chassis of various sizes. They described them in their bid as Chevrolet. Turns out they were actually GM truck, but that wasn't really critical to the analysis here, except I think to the extent that it doesn't seem like Bobby Murray ever accurately or specifically identified the goods themselves that they were ultimately unable to provide. Months before Bobby Murray actually defaulted and breached by failing to deliver the chassis, they knew that there were going to be potential supply issues. They didn't notify the buyers of the chassis unavailability until December 11th, 1990, at which point the plaintiffs bought the chassis that they needed for their buses from another source and sued Bobby Murray for the $150,000 odd difference. So now this case is in a North Carolina appellate court. The trial court ruled for the plaintiffs in summary judgment. And the claim here that Bobby Murray is making is commercial impracticability. It wasn't our fault, Bobby Murray says, that we didn't get the chassis to you. It was the failure of GM to supply us the chassis. And so the failure of GM to supply these chassis to us and the governmental regulation, which ultimately prohibited installing one of the engine types that we'd included in our bid, are both events that should excuse our performance due to impracticability. And so the court articulates the elements of a 2615 claim, and they are, first, the performance has become impracticable. Well, it certainly seems like Bobby Murray does not have and cannot get the chassis to supply to the buyer. 2, the impracticability was due to the occurrence of some contingency which the parties expressly or impliedly agreed would discharge the promisor's duty to perform. Right? Now, the express is where we get into things like force majeure clauses, where the parties expressly agree if something happens, we will be released from performance. Where you get more debate often is in these notions of impliedly agreed. Impliedly is really just code for, can a court going in after the fact and thinking about, well, what did the parties really intend at the time, say, well, we can imply that this was part of their intention. Right. 3, the promisor did not assume the risk that the contingency would occur. And 4, the promisor seasonably notified the promisee of the delay in delivery or that delivery would not occur at all. So looking through these elements, the court finds a lot of fault in terms of what Bobby Murray did. Was there an exclusive source of supply specified in the contract or implied by the circumstances? No. And in fact, the language that was incorporated into Bobby Murray's bid, language that I gather actually came from the buyer's request for proposal, request for bids, but which Bobby Murray referenced in its own bid to the buyer. The language says references to manufacturers' names are not intended to be restrictive. The court points out that North Carolina has UCC practice forms that say you can include things like what they call a single source clause, where a seller says, just so you understand, buyer, I am only getting these goods from a source, a single source that you name, and in the event of any interference or cessation in the supply from seller's source of supply, the seller shall temporarily, proportionately, or permanently be relieved of liability under this contract. And they note that both their own test under 2615 and the bid itself required notice of alterations or changes at once, and that also included that it was the responsibility of the successful bidder to notify this division at once in the event any governmental restrictions may be imposed. So because Bobby Murray had been deficient in doing those things, they found that ruling for plaintiffs in summary judgment was proper. A few quick points to make about leases and how those provisions compare to Article 2 sales. Very similar under Article 2A, with really the big exception being for non-consumer, in other words, commercial finance leases. In those kinds of leases, you'll recall, we have the hell or high water type provisions for payments. And so while Article 2 and Article 2A for leases of goods allow some sort of offset at the buyer or lessee's option, right? If the goods are damaged in some way. In finance leases for non-consumers, it's terminate the lease or go forward with the payments to your finance lessor because you have agreed to pay no matter what as the lessee. Let's finish our discussion today with a look at our case about the Convention for the International Sale of Goods. And what we can take away from this, and what we frankly have seen on other occasions in this course when we're talking about how an American court is going to attempt to do a convention analysis, it's a lot of argument by analogy to our own UCC. We have raw materials as our first party. They're a Chicago-based buyer of steel. And we have Forberish, who is a German company that sells used rails, right? Those rails can be melted down and made into new steel products. The parties agree that the shipment of the rails from Russia was going to be delayed. But there's an active dispute going on about whether the parties had pushed back the delivery date to a point where, there's a cutoff for when those goods need to have been shipped from Russia in order to have properly arrived in the US on time. Raw materials, the American company's contention is that, well, ultimately we seem to have agreed that they needed to be here by December 31st. And so if the goods were to have gotten here by December 31st, they should have been shipped several weeks ahead of that. The German company's contention is, well, we had not firmly agreed to when these rails were going to be shipped, and we have an excuse of essentially commercial impracticability because we could not get the goods out of the port that they were supposed to ship from because the rails were trapped there. In fact, all of the boats were trapped in the port. The port had frozen over in St. Petersburg. So Forbush is claiming excuse. We couldn't ship them. The rails were trapped. The court likens the UCC analysis in Article 79, this idea that a party can be excused by failure due to an impediment beyond his control, and that he could not have reasonably taken the impediment into account, likens that to our 2615 analysis, that there's a contingency, it makes performance impracticable, and the non-occurrence of that contingency was a basic assumption of the contract, and says essentially we believe the evidence that Forbush is giving us that St. Petersburg's port was frozen. There were no ships getting out. There's really a strong suggestion, I think, in this case that raw materials fell down on the job of presenting evidence to show that Forbush was somehow remiss, or that they really could have shipped the goods out. The court says, for instance, on page 277, no conclusive evidence has been presented that any ships left the St. Petersburg port until months after November 20th, 2002, which was the last time when the defendant was able to ship anything out of that port. And so I think they found rather glib some of the plaintiff's arguments around the fact that, well, any school child can tell you it hardly could come as a surprise to any experienced shipping merchant or any grammar school geography student that a port in St. Petersburg might become icy and frozen in the Russian winter months. The court looks at that and they're like, that's not evidence. So here, there were sufficient findings of fact for this case to go to trial. Just a quick note, under 2615, it appears sellers can be excused when their assumed source of supply fails to deliver for any reason. Now, Article 79 of the Convention sort of applies this same standard to third-party sources of supply for sellers. So the third-party source that fails to supply whatever the seller needs to go forward, that third-party source also must have a valid basis for excuse. That's it for the lecture. I apologize. I think this lecture will run rather long, but hopefully that will mean on the flip side that we can keep our discussion fairly short when we meet via Skype for Business tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. Thank you.